Okay, today's topic is modalities. I think we've finished up with our introductions to metaphysics. I think actually we went one lecture over, so we may have to catch up at some point. Okay, so modalities. These refer to logical modalities, primarily for our purposes, though there are other modalities. So the logical modalities, anyway, main ones are possibility, necessity, impossibility, and contingency. Given any one of these, though, you can define the other three in terms of that. So, given possibility, you could define necessity how? If something's
it's not possible that it's not.
Yeah. So that would be how you would get necessity, and then impossibility would be not possible.
Right.
And contingency would be both that it's possible and that its opposite or negation is possible. So you can, these are all interdefinable. They form kind of a family of concepts. You could pick any one of them and define the other three. But then you'd have to come up with a definition of that last one.
What do you mean with the last one?
Or the one that you're using to define the other three. And you'd have to go outside the circle of modality to do that, and no one's ever figured out how to do that, really. So if you take possibility as your basic one, then there doesn't seem to be any ready way to define what that is. It's sort of a primitive concept.
Is there anything wrong with having it be a primitive concept?
Not for me. Not definable.
Not consistent with the other definition.
Well, primitive can be understood in one of two ways. One way is that you introduce it without any definition, so you take it as primitive without any commitment as to whether there is actually some definition of it or not. So within the construction of a system, like a formal system or any kind of systematic approach to anything, you may take certain concepts or notions or properties as primitive or undefined. The stronger claim is that in truth they are indefinable, so that which would be to say that it's not possible, using that modal term, not possible to define what possibility is or whatever primitive concept you're introducing. Say in geometry, you might take the concept of a point as and a line as undefined terms. Yeah.
So that being said, despite the fact that we don't have a solid working definition for possibility, we still on some level grasp the meaning in a way where we can use it meaningfully.
Right, but we have an understanding of the concept. I mean, we can say that something is possible when it does not entail a contradiction. A contradiction is a proposition which both asserts something and denies that very same thing, such as this object is round and not round at the same time. Because it could be round at one time and not round at a different time. That's not problematic. The contradiction would be at one and the same time, it's both round and not round. Or at one of the or that we have a spherical cube. Since cube implies not sphere, and sphere implies not cube, a cubical sphere would be impossible due to its entailing a contradiction. which would be a round, not round thing at the same time, or a square, not square thing, both at the same time. So the law of non-contradiction, or the law of contradiction, it's been called both, which says that nothing can both be and not be in some respect at the same time, is kind of the ultimate principle of possibility. It's not really much of a definition of possibility because you have to use this idea of entailment.
Right.
And that then becomes your primitive, or if you try to define it, you have to use possibility. Or necessity, or whatever you want, to define what entailment is. I mean, if all the impossible things were explicitly, formally contradictions, then we could use the principle of contradiction to just explain totally or define what impossibility is, and then we could get all the others. Because remember, we can, if given impossibility, we could define the other three. Unfortunately, that's not the case. Like even the example of the spherical cube shows that, because a spherical cube is not formally contradictory. The thing that's formally contradictory is a round, not round thing. That's a formal contradiction. But the spherical cube is not. So you have to derive the contradiction from it, which you can do, but then you need the modal notion of derivability or entailment. So then you're back to this thing. Yeah.
Could possibility be stated as the negation of all other modalities?
No, is it possibility? No, we said what it was. It's not necessarily not. So possibilities in modal logic is expressed by the diamond. And the diamond P is equivalent to not necessarily not P.
And that's an example of possibility, or?
Well, this is just a formula. P, you have to pick a P. So it's just saying the condition that P has to meet to be possible is that it's not necessary that P is false. If it's necessary that P is false, then P is impossible, and so not possible. Impossible is simply squiggle diamond P. Right? Not possibly P. Right, so these are all propositional modalities. That is, the modality attaches to a proposition. So we see that it's expressed by a sentential operator, or a proposition, I should say a propositional operator. The diamond, which stands for possibility, and the box, which stands for necessity. The diamond and the box here are used as prefixes to a proposition. So they come in front of the proposition. There are what is called propositional operators. In this use, they attribute necessity to a propositional unit. Okay, so an example could be that necessarily 2 and 2 is 4. Okay. So this will be a true statement, because it is necessarily true that 2 and 2 is 4. But if you say necessarily Trump is president, that'll be false. Right?
Can you elaborate?
Well, because it's possible that Trump isn't president, right?
Oh, really? Because it's not a concrete fact, or why?
No, just because there could be a time at which Trump is not president. There was, in fact.
Oh, there was a
Trumphood
time.
isn't necessary for a president.
Yeah, now I understand. That's a little
It's
specific.
sufficient.
Well, you don't want to confuse. It sounds to me like you may have been sort of blurring the distinction between certainty and necessity.
Yeah.
Because you're saying you're certain that Trump is president, so he can't not be president. But that's an epistemic claim. not a modal claim. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so certainty versus.
I mean, Descartes would say you're not certain that Trump is president because it could all just be a dream. You know, but putting that aside as just a Cartesian fantasy or pie in the sky philosophizing, you can say for all practical purposes, I have what Descartes called moral certainty. Whenever Trump is president, it's just it's a philosophical exercise to suppose that we're deceived about that, but. Point is that it's not necessarily true.
Wittgenstein wrote an entire book called
Yeah.
Uncertainty.
Okay, I have a question as to what a kind of
Everyone following me here?
how if a proposition. Okay, earlier in the class, like a linguistics class, we went over some Bertrand Russell's on denoting, and one of the sentences we worked with to play around with concepts was the present, Queen of France.
Yeah.
Wears a crown or has a crown. Obviously the present Queen of France has no referent. So would that be an impossibility for that statement to be true? And if so, would that put it in the same category as saying something like, I have a round or a square sphere?
No, that's going to be a contingent proposition. It'll be false, but contingent.
Oh, because it's possibly. Wait, it's both.
Yeah, something can be both contingent and possible. So,
but it would be the present one. So this one is qualifying it, not just could there be.
yeah, but according to Russell's understanding of the present King of France is bald, or the present Queen of France wears a crown, or whatever. Those statements turn out to be false because there does not exist an X such that X is the unique thing having the property of being Queen of France, being a Queen of France. He says there's one and only one thing, that's the Queen of France, right?
So Russell says...
There's at least one thing that's a Queen of France, there's at most one thing that's a Queen of France, and everything that's a Queen of France wears a crown. Right. So that's Russell's analysis of the Queen of France wears a crown, and if there doesn't exist a Queen of France, one of those conjuncts is false, making the whole statement false. But not impossible, because there could have been a Queen of France. Now, if there hadn't been a French Revolution... Okay, so it won't be impossible. So anyway, P is contingent says that P is possible and it's false that P is possible. P is impossible says P is impossible says P is not possible.
What did you mean when you wrote P is contingent?
Yeah.
Oh, never mind. I was applying the not to the entire proposition.
I should say that there are two types of contingent propositions: contingent truths and contingent falsehoods. So Trump is president is a contingent truth, and Hillary Clinton is president is a contingent falsehood.
I misread your first thing. I applied the not to the entire proposition,
Okay.
not just the P. It's confusing.
Wouldn't it be or?
No.
P is possible or...
No, it's and. No, it's and. P is possible and its negation is
Some confusion
possible.
I have. The not is strictly to the P. So P is possible, not P. Just the not. Don't apply it to the whole proposition. It's not a contradiction there. It looks like one. I know, that was confusing me too. It looks like a contradiction.
Okay.
It's ambiguous in
Yeah,
what
so
the not
so
is.
it's contingent that Trump is president because Trump could be president, but at the same time, also it's possible that Trump isn't president
We
at
understand,
another
it just looks
time.
like you wrote a contradiction.
That's what, at first glance, it looks like we're trying to assert that at the same time, P is
No,
possible and impossible.
No, we know that, but it's
Right.
just the way it's written is
Yeah.
confusing.
Sorry.
Yeah, P is necessary, you already said what that was, right? That, no, we said what P is possible, all right. So P is necessary is it's not possible that P is false. Right, and P is possible is it's not necessary that P is false. Right, we already have that one.
Didn't Spinoza have a very heavy work about modalities as well? If I'm not mistaken.
Hmm. It's not necessary that not P is possible. Yeah.
Didn't Spinoza write a heavy work about modalities, like centering on it? How does this like juxtapose to yours?
Which is the work that you're talking
I
about?
think he wrote something about modalities. I forget what it was.
Mm.
But I was wondering if
I'm
you
not
could
sure.
talk about that.
Not sure what you're.
I'll have to dig it up and talk
Okay.
about it.
I
off
think,
the
I think Spinoza has a different interpretation.
Maybe you're thinking of Leibniz, but I'm not sure.
tower.
Maybe, I'm not sure.
I'll bring it up during
Yeah.
next hours.
Okay. Right, so this gives you, for propositions anyway, all of the main things here. So all contingent propositions are possible, but not all possible propositions are contingent. Because necessary propositions are considered to be possible, but they're non-contingent. Because they can't be false. So, just for some simple examples, necessary, like a red thing is colored, 2 and 2 is 4, and so forth. The impossibles are, there's a spherical cube on the table, right? Or 2 plus 2 is 5, impossible thing. Contingent, like Trump is president, Hillary Clinton is president, Bernie Sanders is president, Pete Buttigieg is president. Those are all contingent, either true or false contingent. They could be otherwise. Whatever they are, they could be. And the possible ones may be either necessarily true, like 2 and 2 is 4. It's possible that 2 and 2 is 4 because it's necessary. Or something like there are unicorns roaming the plains of Nebraska, which will be possible, but contingent. Yeah, if you allow the possibility of unicorns.
So with the statement "I exist," is that a contingent? Would that be
That's contingent, yeah. Yeah, Descartes said there's something special about that contingent proposition, which is that you can know it with absolute certainty, which kind of makes it seem like a necessary proposition, but it's obviously contingent because you were born and you die. It can't be necessarily true, right? If it wasn't true before you were born, it won't be true after you're dead.
I thought he got after a necessity when he said, like, I am a thinking thing. Like, P is necessary. It is not possible that I am not a thinking thing, right? Because...
Yeah, we'll get into that issue in a moment. but
Okay.
That has to do with a different application of possibility. So I've only talked about one application of modality, which is to propositions,
Okay.
but there are 2 more. There's the application of possibility to properties and also to beings. So there are 3 ways you can use these modalities. You can apply them to beings, to the properties of beings, and to propositions. These are 3 different applications. Beings, properties of beings, and propositions. Okay, everyone got that? So all we've looked at so far is the propositional domain.
Mhm.
But you can also apply it to beings. You can talk about 4 kinds of beings in theory, which would be possible beings, necessary beings, impossible beings, and contingent beings. So let's have a look at how that goes. I think your example is actually going to apply to the case of the Descartes of properties.
Okay.
The property of thinking in reference to the self. Descartes suggests that he is necessarily a thinking being rather than an extended being.
Right.
So he's using the modal term necessary to as a mode of property possession, saying that the self possesses the property of thought necessarily as opposed to contingently. Whether that's right or not is another question, but that's what he claims in the Meditations, that he is necessarily a thinking being and only accidentally and only incidentally or contingently an extended bodily being. So we have these two attributes, which Spinoza also notes. We have extended bodies and also inner thoughts.
And that's what I'm trying to talk about.
Yeah, and like how exactly do you understand or interpret that state of affairs?
I wouldn't say
Is a perennial philosophical issue to relate inner thought and bodily properties.
Would he really say he is necessary existence? I think it seems more accurate to say he would say, given that I am thinking, it is necessary that I am. Like that's necessary. Okay.
Yeah.
But not that he is necessary existence.
No, I never said that. I said that he possesses the property of thinking necessarily, which I haven't explained yet. But that's the use of modality to attribute as a mode of property possession that I haven't explained yet. But I've only talked about propositional necessity. Necessity is ascribed to a proposition, or possibility is ascribed to a proposition, or whatever. So, but it can also be used as a mode of property possession. These modalities like necessary, contingent, and so on. So we'll get to that. So anyway, so we can talk about necessary beings, contingent beings, possible beings, and what would the last category be? Impossible beings. Yeah, that's kind of like a negative category, right? So that's dubious.
Would Descartes, he wrote that little proof for God, would that be a necessary modality?
Yeah, according to philosophers like Descartes and other earlier theologically minded philosophers during the Middle Ages in continental Europe, God is a necessary being.
Right.
So God would be an example here.
He gives the argument of like, if God is a perfect being, and for God not to exist, that would make him imperfect, so he would no longer be God, or the being of God would no longer be God.
Well, he says that Descartes' version of it is that existence is a perfection, God is a perfect being. You can no more separate God's perfection from God than you can separate a valley from surrounding mountains. So God must exist. That's one version of the ontological argument, but not the only one.
It's a problematic argument.
But anyway, God is thought to have necessary being, which is to say that the proposition that God exists is necessarily true. So what this comes to is that box, God exists. God exists being a proposition now, rather than just a substance. Or
What's symbolizing the box?
the box symbolizes necessity. So what we have here is necessarily God exists. So an impossible being is a necessary being is a being such that the proposition that it exists is a necessary truth. necessary proposition. Yeah, so it seems like that would be a necessary being. Can we think of many other candidates for necessary beings? Other than God, it's hard to come up with too many.
Platonic forms, if that was.
Yeah, maybe. Platonic forms like sphericity exists. Necessarily sphericity. And why would sphericity necessarily exist? Because there's a necessary truth that spheres are round, and how can that be necessarily true unless sphericity necessarily exists? Right?
What about,
It seems.
what if we applied numbers?
In numbers, if it's necessarily true that 2 and 2 is 4, then maybe necessarily 2 exists.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think in all these cases, though, there's going to be a question about the existence of the thing in the first place.
Right.
Like people argue about whether God exists or not. They argue about whether 2 exists or not. They argue about whether sphericity exists or not. So we can certainly say, though, that if any of these things exist, then it exists of necessity, if it exists. That seems safe. Of course, that would not definitively ascribe necessary existence to anything. Just by saying that, we would just be saying if it exists, then it follows that it necessarily exists. But the question would still remain as to whether there are any necessary beings. Right? It's hard to verify directly that there are necessary beings, since all the beings we observe are contingent beings. Contingent beings are beings that can come into being or can pass out of existence. Typically, they're created at some time and pass away at some time. So even the most fundamental building blocks of the universe seem to fall into that category, like electrons and things like that. They can pass out of existence, right? Like an electron could collide with a positron, and then neither would exist anymore, proving that they're contingent beings, though they're a lot more durable than we are. Yeah.
Does this also claim
Okay.
that, oh, sorry.
No, you're gonna go ahead.
Oh, does this also claim that necessary beings don't exist in space-time because they don't pass in and out of being? They don't exist in that realm.
It doesn't seem like we can find any beings in space-time that necessarily exist so far.
Right.
Okay, I'm just, right? What about space-time itself? Well, that may be a better candidate, but you have the same problem. People can argue about whether it exists or not, really. You might say, well, it's just a construct out of extended objects or something, right? It's the extended objects that really exist, and space-time is like a system of relations we abstract from these objects. Others say, no, space is actually, it's a container that holds all these things. I think it's sort of like one of these puzzles. You can sort of see it from either way, right? Depending on your mindset.
Kant argued that it was just like an intuitive thing, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so you know, the quantum vacuum or space-time, does it necessarily exist? There's no firm evidence that it necessarily exists. I guess it might, right? Just like two or sphericity or God, they may well exist, and if they do, they will necessarily exist. Yeah, I mean, you can argue that there's some reason to think that there's a necessarily existing entity. I mean, if you ask, you know, why are there any concrete things at all, rather than like nothing? Why are there any concrete contingent things rather than nothing at all? It's hard to come up with an explanation. or an answer to that without bringing in a necessary being, a productive or creative necessary being. Because if you're asking why there are any concrete contingent things at all, then the explanation of that can't be a concrete contingent thing, right? Because such an answer would beg the question. It would assume that these concrete contingent things all came from some other one, but we're asking why there are any of them at all, right? So it seems like you'd have to go outside the scope of that, which would take you into some kind of necessary being. Maybe a necessary concrete being caused the contingent concrete beings to exist. The character of that necessary being would be an open question. We don't know what it is, but it seems like that you might infer the existence of a necessary cause of contingent things. Yeah.
If God is a necessary being who thinks, then by extension, would we exist only in God by reference of thinking?
Well, I don't know.
We're like God's thoughts or something.
Exactly.
Yeah, well, we never.
Can you
Yeah,
repeat that again?
yeah, we didn't prove that God exists yet.
No, we didn't. prove
No,
it.
we just.
That was Berkeley?
No, all we did was say that there might be some merit in the inference that there's a necessary being that caused the concrete contingent
I was
beings,
going-
but the character of that necessary being is yet to be established. You'd first have to establish that it thinks.
Right.
Descartes claimed he could do that. Yeah.
So I have a question. So say someone were to, like, the idea of, say, like the vacuum, of like a vacuum, like the absence of anything.
Yeah.
Right? If someone were to say, would that be a necessary being or a contingent being? Because you could, the way that I think about it is that if I think of a vacuum as like that, say like something passes out of existence and then there's the vacuum that's left, does that mean that is contingent only upon the existence of something existing in the first place for which that it can take the place of to pass out of existence? Or is it necessarily, or doesn't exist, or does it exist necessarily?
Yeah,
because
well,
something can pass out of
yeah, well,
existence in the first place?
yeah, these, there are different theories you could put forward about these things. But I think if you say the quantum vacuum's a necessary thing, you're not saying it's wholly negative. You're ascribing some positive powers to it,
Yeah,
like to produce particles and stuff like that. So it has energy in it. So it's not a negative entity. So, on that conception of a vacuum, if you think of a vacuum just as nothingness, then that's what it is, nothing. And it has no existence, and therefore it can't have necessary existence either. So, yeah, that's my answer. For what it's worth. Does that make any sense?
Contingent.
No, it's worth something, yeah. It's worth something.
Yeah, I think so, but I don't know how much. But I think, I'm pretty sure that references to things in current physics, like the quantum vacuum and stuff, attribute all kinds of powers to it, and energy levels, and all kinds of stuff. So it's not just a negative thing. And the word vacuum is, I mean, it's like a wooden nickel. It's neither wooden nor right. Yeah. And so the quantum vacuum, the word quantum there changes it. It's not a vacuum at all. Yeah, it's not a vacuum. Yeah. And maybe it's a vacuum in the sense that it doesn't contain articulated particles or something like that, or need not. But yeah. Was there a question that I didn't get to?
No, you kind of answered it.
Oh.
Answered your question, yeah.
Okay, great. Yeah, so you have these different kinds of beings. So God would be a necessary being. Maybe there's some other necessary beings out there. Who knows? Contingent beings would be, as I said, things that come into being and pass away typically, or which could come into being, could pass away.
Like humans and life?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Humans, planets, all physical objects and events.
So like a lot of things that constitute our reality.
Like everything except for these like, anomalous objects.
Gotcha.
Like God and sphericity and two and stuff like that. whose bona fides are controversial. Yeah,
So we were talking about negative beings. I just had a quick question.
yeah, negative,
Wouldn't negative beings have to
like a
have,
shadow.
or like a hole
Yeah.
or absence or whatever?
Yeah, holes.
Wouldn't they have to have the property of like -1 if we're going to describe like unique instances of like positive beings with the presence of 1? Wouldn't negative beings have to be
I don't know where this one thing is coming from, but you could ascribe a quality
Right.
of positivity to things like substances and events and colors and stuff, and you could ascribe some negativity thing to these other entities.
Right, like an instance of.
But I don't know how you can put a number on that. It's just,
Right.
it's not a numeric, it's not the same thing as like a +1 or a -1.
So it's not a relation.
No,
But
it's not, it doesn't seem to be a relation. No.
still like.
And it's not part of a arithmetical progression or anything like that.
But if we consider like you as a being, as an instance of Gary Rosencrantz, like you are a singular being.
Yes.
Like don't we get one? Like we have one entity that is Gary Rosencrantz.
Well, yeah,
It's a
it's one
positive.
entity.
It's a positive, right? So why can't we say that like the negative entity carries a -1 insofar as?
Why not say there's one non-existent
Yeah.
entity or whatever it is?
Yes.
Why would it be a go negative? Why not just
Yeah.
say there's
Yeah.
one
that
Darth
doesn't-
Vader that doesn't
It
exist?
doesn't exist, right?
Yeah, or there's one shadow there
Yeah, the
and
negative doesn't
another one
add.
on the other wall.
There's a negative existence of there.
Or what if he's in a mirror and there's one Gary, but then there's as many mirror reflections as you want.
Yeah.
Well, those are
Infinite
reflections of.
Yeah.
But the shadow or the reflection can be like almost like parallel ideas of like what you're getting at is like a negative being, something that is not there but still is, right?
Because you're assuming a negative.
We are assuming that.
Yeah, I
It
mean,
can be a mirror reflection as well.
look, if there are negative beings, then they get the same status as beings just as beings as anything else.
Right, they get a positive.
In that sense, they're
In that
they're
sense.
beings. You know. Now that they're negative is a whole other thing. It's that
Right.
their reality consists in the absence of certain things,
Right.
whereas the reality of people exists in the presence of certain things. So,
Right.
You would have to have a proof developing a negative.
Right. It would seem that like negative beings have, if any property, it would be the property of like 0, because they don't exist.
okay, but then they're not beings. So.
Yeah,
Being-
zero exists.
Right.
Then we eliminated them.
That's a. That's
Yeah, but you have to
capital.
decide which camp you're in. That there
Oh,
are
I'm
those
against
things.
the
No, I mean
argument.
one has to decide which camp they're in.
Right.
Whether they believe that those things have reality or think that they don't.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
Okay. Right. So, and then possible beings are either necessary. The class of possible beings are the contingent beings plus the necessary beings. Either one, considered a possible being because it could exist. So God would be a possible being, and so would Trump. So necessary beings.
What would be an example of a positive being? You said like the possibility of the president being Trump.
A possible being.
Yeah, possible being. Like
Yeah, possible being is any contingent being like Trump, and also any necessary beings that might be like God or space-time, or the number 2, sphericity. Those are just considered possible because they could be. They must be, so.
Only if they were actually necessary would they be possible. 'cause if
Yes,
they're not-
yeah, only if they're necessary. Otherwise, they're impossible and they fall into squeeze.
Well,
So God's either a necessary being or an impossible being, the way God is understood.
That's right.
Yeah, the way God's understood.
So maybe a necessary.
God with a big G. Of course, God with a little g, like Thor or whatever, he's a contingent being.
So an example of a necessary being God, but Descartes' interpretation of God, and then an impossible being could be like an atheist interpretation of God. That God is impossible to exist.
Yeah. Yeah. Or God is some kind of contingent being or something, right? Like Zeus or Thor or Odin, right? Like Odin dies at the end, right? And Thor takes over for him and then passes the baton to a Valkyrie or something.
Gary Rosencrantz, God of metaphysics.
Yeah.
Possible God.
Yeah, so that's how it goes with these things. And then impossible beings actually then take us into that kind of negativity place, whether we want to recognize those as a category of being or not, right? Like a spherical cube is an impossible being. You can say that's not a being at all, right?
Right.
There are no impossible beings. A spherical cube would be one if there are any examples of them. Yeah.
So I have a question about the difference and the way these, like I understand everything you're saying.
Good.
But with necessary beings, contingent beings, and everything.
Yeah.
How is this different? And specifically, I'm looking at where you put for an example, for necessary beings, you put a sphere, yeah, like being able to be a sphere, I can't pronounce that. The second square down, sphericity.
Sphericity, yeah.
Yeah, sphericity. Why is that not a property?
It's a bit of a tongue twister. It is a property.
Okay, so what's the difference between beings and properties?
There is no difference. The difference is that all properties are beings, but not all beings are properties. Some beings are like substances.
Okay.
Some are relations. Some are processes. Some are privation, absences, maybe. Yeah.
Okay.
Or whatever. Yeah. Some are boundaries.
So
Yeah.
you said that all
But mainly as substances, properties, and events. The things we ordinarily think of as beings, the most important ones. Substances, properties, and events
Okay.
are all beings, but sphericity is a special type of being. It's a property. It's not a substance, right? A substance would be the sphere.
Yeah.
A sphere is a substance, like a sphere of solid gold, which we'd all like to have, right? And sphericity is a quality of that golden sphere, right?
Yeah, sphere.
Yeah, and what would be an event? Suppose we set the sphere spinning,
Yeah.
then the sphere's rotation would be an event. Yeah, so there you have all in one thing, right? Yeah, there's one thing there, but there's three things there, right, that we can consider metaphysically by metaphysical analysis. We can consider the sphericity, we can consider the sphere, which is a substance made of gold, right? Consider the sphericity, which is the quality of sphericalness, which many other spheres also have. And then we have the event of the rotation of the sphere. What other entities could we tease out there?
If we melted it,
Hmm?
if we melted it and changed.
Well, no changes, though. Just with the sphere as we have it right there. What else is lurking there, other than the event, the property, and the substance? There's also the surface of the sphere, right there, which is manifest. That's a boundary between the sphere and all the rest of reality, right?
Could we say it's relation?
The surface kind of, you might say, separates the sphere from the rest of the world, right? Kind of helps articulate it
Is there a boundary?
as a being. Right?
Well, there's a relation.
Because if there were no boundaries, like, how could there be even like separate existences in it, right? Imagine a world without boundaries. It would become just like one.
Big mush.
It would just be like one thing, right? If there were no boundaries in it.
Well, Earth would qualify also as a relation because it does everything you're saying, but it's also related to other objects, like the sun.
Yeah, well, there are relations too, but they're not that manifest if you just have a single sphere. But it seems like you at least have, right? If you set it in motion, maybe for motion you need other things. Though I don't think so. Newton kind of proved that you could have motion without any other
Without
things.
gravity?
You know what I'm talking about? He had this example of you have a bucket of water and a string holding it up, and it's twisted around, right? And then even if there's nothing else in the universe, a spinning bucket with water in it, the water will go up the sides. So if you're just in the bucket, right? Even if there's nothing else in the universe but the bucket and what's in the bucket, which is the water and you're going to see the water like lap up, go up the sides of the bucket when it's spinning. But when it's not spinning, it won't do that.
But won't we need like a force to drive it up?
There's gravity involved.
You know?
Well,
No, it doesn't matter. It'll go up the sides whether there's like
Oh.
on Earth or not. In outer space, it'll do the same thing.
Oh, okay, so
It's an accelerated motion.
that makes sense.
So, yeah. So the point is you can have rotation without like other things. Newton thought from that space must be this absolute container rather than a relation to other things. That's a dubious conclusion, though it's intuitive, but it doesn't seem like it really follows. But it seems to at least follow that either that's true or there is absolute motion. So absolute motion would be a motion that something has independently of its relation to anything else. So maybe there's absolute motion. Accelerated motions maybe are absolute. Right. So,
But couldn't the person who denies absolute motion just say that even in the case of the spinning bucket, you're only talking about its motion relative to the person, holding the string?
yeah. Well, that's what Mach said. Ernst Mach, a positivistic philosopher, early 20th century, late 19th century. Mach said that if you take away everything else, the water wouldn't go up the sides. But there's no way to verify that. And I think general relativity says that the water still would go up the sides, even if there was just the one thing. But yeah, there are other alternatives. But the main issue is absolute space, and that's the thing that doesn't really follow from the spinning bucket. If you grant it, then you maybe get absolute motion, but that's a lot less consequential than absolute space. Anyway, so from a single object, there are a lot of like different beings lurking there, which was the point. I got off on a tangent, metaphysical tangent here, but the point I was trying to make was if you just even have a single thing, there's a whole bunch of things like lurking there that you can start to tease out if you look at it. Substances, events maybe, properties, boundaries, all kinds of stuff, all crammed in there. Right? So it doesn't seem true to say that you can't have more than one entity in a place at the same time. Though it may be true that you can't have more than one entity of a given particular category in a place at the same time, or for some categories that may be true. Like you can't have two material substances in the same place at the same time, or at least not two macroscopic ones, not two big ones. Maybe you could have two little ones that overlap, like at the micro level, like bosons and stuff like that. But the big ones surely not. You can't get like two objects in the same place at the same time. They just don't. They don't go. The force fields just keep them apart. But apparently at the really micro level, there are some particles like bosons which you get an Einstein Bose condensate and they kind of merge. Not 100%, but like they overlap like big time. Yeah.
I was gonna ask. I think you cleared it up. And I was asking if there any like in the geometric sense of place.
Yeah. I mean, you do have the Pauli exclusion principle, which says that for certain types of microparticles, they absolutely can't be in the same place at the same time. But it only applies to a certain class of particles. And it doesn't apply to bosons. So bosons you can have more than one in the same place at the same time, but not say for electrons you can't. So there you can't have two particles in the same place at once, which fits our common sense intuitions of things. Other particles defy our common sense intuition. And you can see that with stuff like light, right? Like beams of light. Like you can shine a beam of light this way, and then you can shine another beam like right through it,
And then they just pass right through.
and they don't like have any effect. Not only they pass, they don't even like know that they're there, right? There's no indication that one beam of light's affected at all by the other beam of light. So how does that work, right? Well, those are not the kinds of photons are not those kinds of particles. run into difficulty with being in the same place at the same time. So, yeah. So beams of light, you can crisscross them. Tables, not so much.
Not easy.
No. All right, so that gives you your different kinds of beings here. Any questions about? So we get modality is applied to propositions and then it's applied to beings. And then the third class now takes us into that Descartes example that was raised about do I necessarily think or am I necessarily extended in space? What? So these have to do with attributions of contingent or necessary properties to objects. Okay? Okay, so there are necessary properties and contingent properties, possible properties, and impossible properties. Okay? But the main ones are the necessary properties and the accidental properties. No one talks about the others.
That was Aristotle.
And what's the other one? Necessary and contingent. Yeah, sometimes philosophers talk about essential and accidental properties. So which would the essential ones be? They'd be the same as the
necessary.
and the accidental as the contingent. However, they may not be exactly, I mean, it depends on your theory. Aristotle said that things may have many necessary properties, but only one essence. And some philosophers agree with that. So the essence is a particular of these necessary properties which expresses the nature of the object. So in your case, of the case of a person, it would be, being a rational animal, right? Would be the essence of a human, say for Aristotle. We might have lots of necessary properties like being human and being an animal, right? But the only one that's the essence is the two together, being a rational animal. Because that like says what we are. So that was kind of Aristotle's idea of an essence. An essence is made up out of necessary properties but expresses the true nature of the thing. And each thing has only one essence according to that way of thinking. So what would the essence of this thing be?
Chair.
It being a chair. Right? It might have other necessary properties like being solid. But the essence is being a chair. Right? Aristotle doesn't want to call all the necessary properties essences because only one of those properties says what the chair is. If you ask what is that, the essence is the answer to that question, according to Aristotle's way of thinking. And some contemporary philosophers want to revive that idea. Others don't. They say, well, things could have lots of essences, like it's arbitrary to say.
Is that a derivative of Plato's forms, you think?
Well, maybe in some way. I mean, I think Plato tended to think of sensible things as highly imperfect, transitory, and not fully real, so that he wouldn't be inclined to ascribe primary essences to them.
I was thinking
Aristotle thinks of these things in the natural world, though, as full-fledged beings, the only ones. He doesn't believe in a Platonic realm of independently existing essences. Or at least not for the most part.
I was just wondering if he modified anything in his instruction, coming from Plato.
Well, sure, he studied under Plato, and he did agree with Plato that things have, that there are essences. Sure. Plato thought there were essences. But he thought those were the ultimate beings themselves. Aristotle wants to bring a lot more of things in nature into this whole picture of essences and not have it be separate.
Not metaphysically separate.
No. He believes in immanent universals in things. Yeah.
Didn't Aristotle disagree with Plato? Plato thought that like since the essences can exist independent from the concrete things, the essence could stay in existence even if we wiped out all
Yes.
the concrete things. But Aristotle thought that if we
Yes.
wiped out all the concrete things, the essence is gone.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Well, not only that, so Plato, yeah, that's perfectly correct what you say. I mean, Plato thinks of sphericity as one of these geometric forms, as a perfect sphere, but you'd be hard pressed to locate perfect spheres anywhere. So that raises the question of what are we talking about? If we're Aristotelians, what are we talking about when we talk about sphericity? If we're talking about something in things, it's not clear that we find that in any of the things that we can identify. Where do we find like a perfect sphere? We don't know, right? None of the objects that we describe as spheres are perfectly spherical. Geometrically, a sphere has to be perfect to be a sphere. But no actual objects measure up to that, unless microparticles do, like electrons or something. But we can't tell whether they do or not. And even if it's sphere, this picks some other property then, like cubes or something, right? Microparticles aren't going to be cubes, right? If they're going to be anything, they're going to be spheres, right? Or blobs. But it doesn't seem like they're going to wind up being like triangles and cubes and stuff like that. So it seems like there'll be some unexemplified geometric properties. Aristotle has a problem with those. Plato has the advantage there, I think, because he believes in those things. They provide an account of what we're talking about when we talk about geometrical shapes and forms and things. I'm not sure how Aristotle would accommodate that kind of talk, since we don't find those things in the world. So that would be a good paper topic. Any thoughts about that? All right, well, so we have these two types of properties. All right, so consider necessity as applied to a proposition, okay? So how do we symbolize necessity? Remember with a box, a little square, remember that? That's a square, that's necessarily, right? So if we apply it to a proposition as opposed to a property, right? We could say necessarily 7 is odd, right? Could we say necessarily the number of continents is odd? Is the number of continents is 7, right? There's 7 continents.
Okay, so it's a contingent fact.
Yeah. So what are the 7 continents?
North America, South America, Australia,
Asia, Europe, Antarctica.
Eurasia is like one, actually. So I guess
Yeah, but they counted as 2.
yeah.
It's just the way it is. So that makes 7, right? 7 continents. They say like a long time ago there was only like one big continent, Gowanda, Gagaland.
Yeah, there's been like several.
Be quiet, you. Yeah. So there was this one continent at one point.
She's in the continent.
Yeah. So it doesn't seem like we can say that that's true, necessarily true. It's not. Okay. But this one is, despite the fact that 7 is identical with the number of continents. And that's all fine. 7 is identical with the number of continents, but it's not necessarily true that the number of continents is odd. It is necessarily true that 7 is odd. Okay. What if we say 7 is necessarily odd? So now notice the necessarily is in the middle of the statement rather than being in front of the statement. So here the necessarily was out here. Here now it comes after the is. So this is called the divided sense of necessity. Medieval philosophers distinguish between the divided sense and the composite sense of necessity. It's a grammatical distinction. The compounded sense is when necessity prefixes the sentence in which it occurs, and it's a divided sense when necessity occurs in the middle of the sentence in which it occurs. So there was a compound sense and sensu composito and sensu divisio, the Latin terminology for those things, which is the compound sense and the divided sense of necessity and possibility. Okay. So what about our sentence here? 7 is necessarily odd. That seems true because 7 could not have been even. Right?
So is that an essence? Or
Yeah, that's a kind of essence. It's a necessary property.
But it's not an accident.
It's not an
That's the
accident.
question I'm asking.
No, it's
What would
not.
be an accident?
Of 7?
Yes.
Uh,
The fact that the letter
being my
above
favorite,
is
being my lucky number.
Oh, so it's almost as if 7 being your lucky number is not really contingent on 7 existing. It just so happens.
Yeah, it just so happened because we like to think of that because we're like
that one. Are you saying that that's
because we're silly creatures who think
Accident
that.
of 7? That seems to be an accident of you. Out of 7, it's not clear to me how 7 can have an accident.
Okay, well, if you want to say it can't have an accident, that's fine with me. But it does seem like it's a relational situation that 7 enters into. So
I mean, it's pretty arbitrary that it is lucky, but
yeah, or that I'm thinking of it.
as lucky.
No, just that I'm thinking of 7.
Yeah.
What?
Suppose I'm thinking of 7 right now. I'm thinking that 7 is odd, so I'm thinking of 7. Rosencrantz is thinking of 7. If you say that's a relational property of 7, it's also a property of me that I'm thinking of 7, of course, but that's an intrinsic property of me that I'm thinking of 7. But it would be a relational property, if it's a property at all of 7, right, that I'm thinking of it, and that would be something that's true only accidentally because I could cease to exist and 7 would go on
Right.
being a part of all the equations that it's part of.
So are these terms necessary, essence, contingent, and accident? How would be a good way to relate those 4 terms?
Well, we don't really need to get into the whole essence thing. I mean, we can just operate with necessary properties and contingent properties.
I was just asking.
That's simpler. Yeah, I said an essence is a nature of a thing. So it's a necessary property which expresses what kind of being it is. And Aristotle thought that things just have one essence. It seems like if you don't think that, there's really no need to have the concept of essence. You could just go with the concept of a necessary property. But it's not clear what I mean, there are many things such that it's not clear what their essence is. I mean, the theory seems to work well for tables and chairs and all those things. But I mean, it's not really clear, like, what the essence of, say, a platypus is. Or something like that. I mean, you can say it's to be a platypus, right? But doesn't carry a lot of conviction. That that that's its only, that that's its central identifying property. Right, so 7 is necessarily odd. That tells us that oddness is a necessary property of 7, which is a way of saying that 7 cannot exist without that property. 7 cannot exist without oddness, without being odd.
So it could never be subdivided in an even manner?
No, that's 7. 6 can, 8. That's 7. Right? It's part of the necessary nature of 7. I mean, I guess for Aristotle, the essence of 7 would be what? I don't know, being a number or something. But again, it seems arbitrary, right? Why is it being a number as opposed to being 7? I don't know.
I would say that he would probably agree that like 7 is a contingent property of number. Like, you can have a number, but it doesn't have to be 7.
Yeah, so what's the essence of 7? I don't because Aristotle doesn't believe in the existence of the number 7, but only concrete things. But it'd be hard to come up with one. I mean, is it being the number that comes after 6, so the number before, right? It comes before 8, or is it, what, I mean, what number, what is the essence?
Wouldn't it be a shape rather than a concrete entity? Wouldn't it be a shape?
Oh, I don't know.
Oh, like 7 being a geometric.
Right.
Well,
Right.
it's not how we represent it in the base 10 system, but the actual, like, the underlying, what we're trying to represent.
Yeah, I'm coming from Aristotle's viewpoint, it would have to be a shape, because it couldn't be,
Oh.
it's not concrete.
Oh, you
Like a
have it.
7-sided object?
Yeah.
A septagon?
Right, right. That would be 7, yeah.
Yeah, I have no idea. Pythagoreans thought that every entity in the universe has a special number to it, which expressed its essence. So, and it had to do with like what the smallest number of straight lines that you could use to draw like a stick figure representation of that object. So like you would need a certain number of lines to draw like a primitive image of a bed, and a different number to draw an image of a table, and a different number to make a cow or a dog. And they said, so each thing has its number, and that's its real essence. So these things seem very arbitrary, right? It was kind of like a primitive concept of analytical geometry. They thought that there was a number for each thing, but that can't really be true. that everything has a unique number in that way.
Yeah, Jewish mythology goes there too.
Right, the Kabbalah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so 7 cannot exist without oddness. Oddness is a necessary property. Switching over to possibility, you get the same phenomenon. So a contingent property is going to be a property that an object has which it possibly lacks, as opposed to a necessary property, which is a property of an object that it must have whenever it exists. Contingent property is a property that it needn't have when it exists. It may have it, right? But it needn't have it.
Being a professor?
Yeah, being a professor is a contingent property of professors.
Right.
So if you say necessarily a professor is a professor, that's going to be true. This is a proposition that a professor is a professor. But a professor is necessarily a professor is false. Because a professor might have been a cab driver, very likely, given the job market for professors. A professor is necessarily a professor is a false statement, because a professor is possibly not a professor. even though necessarily a professor.
Well, the first one seems like an identity statement.
Yes, so it's necessarily true.
Yeah.
But this one, you see, it necessarily occurs in front here. But here it occurs in the middle. So you say a professor is such that he couldn't exist if he wasn't a professor. That's false. It's true that a professor is possibly not a professor. This is the true one. Professor is possibly not a professor. Another example. Necessarily, a man who is sitting is not standing. It's a necessary truth that if I'm sitting, then I'm not standing. And vice versa. Necessary truth that if I'm standing, I'm not sitting. Okay. But a man who is sitting is possibly standing is true. A man who is sitting possibly stands, right?
But how?
Like he gets up.
Oh! He has the potential to stand.
Yeah.
Just because he's sitting doesn't mean he can't sit.
Right, okay, yeah. Him sitting is not a necessary condition for him being a man, but him
Right.
being a man means that he can stand or sit, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
So this is the difference between the compound sense and the divided sense of modalities.
Mm-hmm.
This is also called, the divided sense is also called de re, and the compound sense de dicto. De re means of the thing. Of the thing. De dicto means of the proposition, of the dictum. So we can talk about ascriptions of necessity and possibility de dicto and ascriptions of necessity and possibility de re. Ascribing necessity and possibility of things and their properties, things in relation to their properties, or ascribing necessity and possibility to propositional claims that may be necessarily true or not. Okay, so on that note, we shall stop. Remember that we have papers due on Thursday. Yeah.